Pagliuco Enterprises International Education Division presents Unit 2, Part 2, History as Storyteller. Okay, welcome to History as Storyteller. And from here, we are just doing a little bit of a review from the first part of our unit, which was History as Philosopher. And hopefully we were able to explore the idea with our classes of what is a hero and how a hero to some people is not necessarily a hero to others. And we could think about what makes a hero, and that's what makes this a philosophy-minded portion of the unit. Of course, Uncas was a very complicated figure and very divisive in many ways, heroic to some, and traitor to others. So it's important to remember that our unit here is a history unit, but it's actually a history unit about history. So for instance, we're not really doing a major study of a historical period. Instead, what we're doing is we're investigating the purposes or the uses of history. And our second example of that is history as storyteller. And when we approach history in this way, we're asking, what history do we celebrate and why do we celebrate it? Now, sometimes we celebrate history that's not always positive. For instance, Essex, for a very long time, has had the Losers' Day Parade because back in the War of 1812, the Essex residents didn't really fight back against an invasion by the British. And the British attacked the town and burnt 28 ships. And they really got away with it pretty scot-free. But nevertheless, Essex still celebrates that event. And in our unit, we will be focusing on the story of the Charter Oak. Later on down the line, and you might revisit these through the paddles that maybe you've been incorporating in your class. We've had philosopher, we've had storyteller, maybe sometimes your students were acting as judges and also as investigators. So from here, we're going to be spending a lot of our time as history as storyteller. And I'll try to, as is customary, I'll try to customize this lesson for our unit, or this talk for our unit. So in the beginning, we're going to be talking about why do we tell stories? And what are lessons and values that stories can hold? So for instance, they might think of stories that they know in their own lives and what lessons they can draw from it. You might mention Aesop's fables, for instance, and use one of them as an example, and I'll build some of these into the lessons. And another thing is what is a value? What are the values that we hold dear in our society? And so this is where our investigation of history as storyteller will start. Our first lesson is going to be focused on legends of George Washington, the I cannot tell a lie story, in which he tells his father that he chopped down the cherry tree, and his father says, well, I can't punish you because your honesty is worth as many as 1,200 dead cherry trees. And that's trying to explain that George Washington's greatness has stemmed from his character. A second one is the legend of George Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac. Even though that was impossible, and because it's just such a wide river, especially in that area, it suggests that Washington's greatness was a result of his physical prowess. So we have George Washington's brilliant character and physical prowess which help explain why he's great. Well, of course, with Martin Luther King, we're also celebrating a story, and we're celebrating nonviolent resistance in the name of liberty and equality. And so you might bring up, I know the students have done an investigation to some extent of our holidays. So you might, and Martin Luther King Day is coming up. So that is a nice story that we celebrate as an American culture. For further detail, obviously, you'll be able to go to the actual lessons and see how we're building upon this, but that gives you an idea. So lesson 2, even though there's going to be a couple of days in lesson 1, of course, there's fewer lessons in this portion of the unit, which is good because we don't have as much time. And we're going to be looking at the legend of the Charter Oak and having the kids construct a storyboard of the story so that we know they know the chronology of the story. And then in lesson 3, we're going to be taking a look at what the word of what symbolism means and why the Charter Oak, this tree, is a symbol for Connecticut that endures. And so in order to do these 3 lessons, we first need to know the story of the Charter Oak. And I'm going to be providing you with that history right now if you are unsure of it. And once again, I'd just like to remind you that this is intended for adults, not for students, and that it's a very broad and complicated history. And I'm telling you this version so that you can simplify it for your students. So we go to our New England map, and if you recall, let's see, where did we leave off in the story of Connecticut? And this is going to be all screwed up, so bear with me. But the year, if I remember, was 1636, and that was the Pequot War. And at that time, we had a Plymouth colony right here, and we had a Massachusetts colony right here, and we had a Rhode Island colony focused around Providence. And then we had the Connecticut colony of Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. And then down here we had the Saybrook colony. And then over here we had the New Haven colony. And I'm sure, I don't actually know the history of New Hampshire, but New Hampshire was probably, oh no, not a colony at that time. But now the year is going to be pretty much 50 years later, and we're talking about the year 1687. And by 1687, we had 2 Indian wars. The first Indian war was the Pequot War, which essentially cleared the Indians or Native American tribes out from the Connecticut, Rhode Island area by and large. And then later, around 1678, we had King Philip's War, which really pushed or relegated the natives out of New England and into, not into really, because they didn't go into New York, but the new frontier where Native Americans had power was not in New England anymore. They were further west into western New York, western Pennsylvania, and so forth. And so by 1687, the Native American threat is removed, and Massachusetts and Plymouth are now together as one colony. And actually, there are many, many towns. They've spread all through Cape Cod, and really, New England is just checkered with towns. And we only have 4 New England colonies at this point. In 1687, we have New Hampshire, we have Massachusetts, we have Rhode Island, and we have Connecticut. At this point, Vermont is still part of New York, and part of it is claimed by New Hampshire, I believe. I don't think it was very clear about that. And Maine, incidentally, was still part of Massachusetts. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 New England colonies in 1687. And we have a very little or relatively insignificant native population in New England by this point. And so by 1687, these colonies were pretty well established. They had their own governments, and they had these governments granted by permission from the king. And permission to have a government from the king is called a charter. And if you established a colony without a charter, you weren't part of the empire, the British Empire. You were just on your own. So this would be the equivalent today of some people going up to the North Pole and settling and saying they were part of the United States. However, the United States never gave them permission to settle or establish a town there. So therefore, they are not part of the United States because they didn't have a charter. So a charter was very important because that was permission to create a colony as part of the empire. And the big advantages of being part of the empire were trade and protection, military protection. So the New England colonies, they were a little bit ambivalent about remaining part of the British Empire. If you remember, they were very Puritan, and England was not Puritan. England was Anglican, meaning they were part of the Church of England. So New England liked to be part of the empire for trade and protection, but they didn't want to be too close to the English Empire because they liked their freedom. And it's interesting because each colony essentially was self-ruled. They were essentially able to elect their own governments, completely independent of the British Crown. So, excuse me, they really liked their self-rule, and that's something that they took pride in. They had their own elected governors, and they had their own elected House of Representatives in each colony. So Massachusetts had their own governor in the House of Representatives, Connecticut had their own governor in House of Representatives, and so forth. And this was something that they took pride in. It was part of their Puritan beliefs. They took pride in their self-rule. Now, it wasn't so much that England wanted the colonies to rule themselves. It was that England was really too weak to enforce their will upon the colonies. So, and that's because England was experiencing a civil war through much of this time. However, let's see if I can get the date right. I think it's 1686, England was getting its act together and they had a new king, King James. And King James didn't want these Puritan colonies to rule themselves anymore. They were barely even really part of the empire. They were really like almost free independent countries within England. It was really unique. And so James said, we are not going to have separate colonies anymore. Instead, we are going to establish the Dominion of New England. And this Dominion was going to consist of all of Maine, all of New Hampshire. Excuse me, 1 second. All of New Hampshire, all of Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, all of Connecticut, all of New York, all of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And these were all going to be governed by one person, and I can't remember what his title was. Maybe I'll remember it in a second. Um, but he was gonna be a governor, and his last name was Andros, and he was royally appointed. He was appointed by King James. So Andros, what he did was he started going around the colonies, and um, he would introduce himself. And he would introduce himself to the different colonies and say, "I am your governor," and they would meet and give him the information that he needed, and then they would turn over their charter, their former permission to be self-governed. So Andros, one second. Okay, Andros, I think it was Major John Andros for some reason, came to Connecticut, Hartford, and they met in the old State House. And Connecticut was not excited about meeting with John Andros. So they dragged their feet and they made the meeting go on and on forever. And eventually it came time for Connecticut to hand over their charter. And what happens is Connecticut, it's dark, it's at nighttime, and they come to the point where they're going to hand over the charter, and all the candles purportedly were blown out by a breeze like that passed through the building because they were very drafty, and the candles were blown out, and in just a few moments they were able to relight the candles, but when they relit the candles, the charter was gone. And a Connecticut resident had stolen the charter, rolled it up, ran out of the State House, and hid it in the crook of a massive tree, a massive white oak tree which ended up becoming the Charter Oak. And the idea is that Connecticut loved self-rule enough, and they hid their charter in this oak to keep from giving up their self-rule to Governor Andros. However, it really didn't matter. It was more of a symbolic act because Governor Andros was like, "Forget it, I'm going to rule you anyway. It doesn't matter whether I have your charter or not. We'll get that in due time." So Connecticut did become part of the Dominion of New England, and they were ruled begrudgingly by Andros for about a year and a half. And what happened, the year that this all took place was in 1687. Well, in 1689, England, back in England, they had what's called the Glorious Revolution. And there was an overthrow of state in which Prince William, overthrew King James. And it was called the Glorious Revolution because it was bloodless, and they were so happy that they didn't have to have another civil war. And you may know the name William because William was married to Mary, and you might have heard the College of William and Mary. Mary was William's claim to the English throne through lineage. Mary, I'm not certain, but I think she was James's sister. So when James was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, New England heard about it in 1689 because the ships took so long to come over and give them the news. Well, as soon as New England heard about the Glorious Revolution and there was no more King James, Connecticut and all the New England colonies, or Massachusetts actually, arrested Andros, sent him on a boat, sent him back to England, and Connecticut pulled out their old charter and they went back to self-rule. So there's a little bit more to the story, but that's the crux of it. So in the end, the charter oak is important to Connecticut history because of a lot of the symbolism of the tree. The first and foremost is that the oak tree was where Connecticut hid the charter, and actually the self-rule of Connecticut. Connecticut, I think, has one of the longest histories of self-rule in the world, going all the way back to the 1630s. So this is a claim to democracy. A second reason why the oak is a symbol of Connecticut is because it was enormous. It was about 1,000 years old. So when things are old, they tend to be revered. They can be sacred. And the oak tree is common to Connecticut. So the oak tree is a great symbol for our area. And then, of course, oaks are very strong. And this was a massive tree. So we have old, strong self-rule. And these are some of the symbols and the reasons why the charter oak is so important to Connecticut. And people have used the charter oak, like there's Charter Oak Federal Credit Union, and there were charter oak bicycles, and we have the charter oak on the quarter as a symbol for Connecticut's. And so, but most of the time, in fact, I don't remember a single time that the charter oak was not. I remember it always being revered and respectful. It's never referred to like in a silly way. So, that, I believe, is the crux of the story of the charter oak. It gets a little bit complicated with King James being overthrown by William and Mary, and why Connecticut had self-rule for so long. But I hope that's clear to you. And if you aren't sure and you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I will have those lessons uploaded, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.